Good day, everyone. Today, we will discuss about the history of social welfare and social work, with the topics covering the Western beginnings. Let's start with Europe.
Good morning, everyone. I am Marjorie Andres and I am honored to share with you the social welfare and social work history of Europe. In 1536, a law was passed in England stating that alms collected by local authorities and churches on Sundays, holidays or festivals were to help relieve the sick and the poor. So what was like England in the 15th century? So in England, in the early 15th century, they have a surfeit of land, they have labor shortage, low rents, high wages, or high salaries. So basically, they are rich in everything. They are rich in assets, resources that could improve their way of life. But they experienced economic depression that resulted to land shortage, labor surplus, high rents, and declining wages. So the focus of the law are for the poor, the sick, impotent, those who are too ill or old to work, or persons with illnesses who were not able to work. So a bill was drawn up calling for the creation of a system of public works to deal with the problem of unemployment to be funded by a tax on income and capital. What are the provisions of the law? Number 1, the illegality of begging, responsibility of society to help, assistance by and through the local community, voluntary alms or something such as money or food given freely to relieve the poor and under the direction of the state. So it was in the provisions of the law that explains who is poor and why they need help. King Henry VIII has full and perfect notice that there is within his realm a great multitude of strong valiant beggars. So who are those beggars? So they are both vagabonds and idle persons, and the old, the sick, the lame, feeble, and impotent persons who are not able to labor for their living but are driven of the necessity to the charity of the people. So vagabonds are persons who wanders from place to place without a fixed home. So King Henry VIII described idleness as the mother and root of all vices. So vagabonds and idle persons might labor for their living, but unlike other loyal servants, they live idly by begging, to the high displeasure of Almighty God, the hurt of their own souls, the evil example of others, and to the great hurt of the commonwealth of his realm. King Henry VIII has perfect knowledge that some of them have fallen into such poverty through sickness and other casualties, and some through their own fault, whereby they have come finally to that point that they could not labor for any part of their living, but are driven by the necessity to live by the charity of the people. King Henry acknowledged that some have fallen into such misery because they have been released from work by their employers because of sickness, leaving them without relief and comfort. Some have been neglected by friends and family and have developed idleness and the belief that they can live well without working. Some have even been taught to beg from childhood, and so for lack of good oversight in youth, many live in great misery as they age. But whatever the reason is, charity requires that some way be taken to help them and prevent that others shall not hereafter fall into like misery. Therefore, King Henry VIII and the Parliament assembled to provide certain remedies to the poor and miserable people in a manner that each parish, which is equivalent to a small local government unit or state, was ordered to help the elderly, to bring up needy children with a work ethic, and to provide work for others without a trade or those who are unemployed. In 1572, overseers of the poor were appointed as civil officers in each parish. Parliamentary enactment at this time provided for a direct public tax for assistance to the poor and destitute. So what are the duties and responsibilities of the overseers? So the overseers were to work out how much money would be needed for the relief of the poor and set the poor rate accordingly. Collect the poor rate from property owners. Relieve the poor by dispensing either food or money, and supervise the parish poorhouse. The Parliament established the parish as the administrative unit responsible for poor relief, with church wardens or parish overseers collecting poor rates and allocating relief. The provision of materials such as flax, hemp, and wool to provide work for the able-bodied poor. The setting to work and apprenticeship of children. The relief of the impotent poor, or the old, the blind, the lame, and so on. So this could include the provision of houses of dwelling, or almhouses or poorhouses rather than workhouses. Any able-bodied pauper who refused to work was liable to be placed in a house of correction or prison. The 1572 Vagabonds Act further enabled justices of the peace to survey and register the impotent poor, determine how much money was required for the relief, and then assess parish residents weekly for the appropriate amount. The Vagabonds Act of 1572 was a law passed in England under Queen Elizabeth, so it is a predecessor to the Elizabethan Poor Laws. Elizabethan Poor Laws. So these laws were enacted during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. So it consolidated all the previous legislation into one massive law and made provision for a compulsory poor rate to be levied on every parish, the creation of overseers of relief, the setting the poor on work, and collection of a poor relief rate from property owners. So towards the close of the 16th century, a civic sense of responsibility on nationwide basis had developed in England.
Early in 1598, the 17 bills dealing with agrarian problems, rights and vagabondage, as well as plight of the needy became an act. It provided a systematic plan for helping the poor and established a system of public responsibility implemented through local care. It was revised in 1601 and have been in operation until 1834. The Poor Relief Act of 1601, also known as the Old Poor Law, or popularly known as the Elizabethan Poor Law, is a major first step in creating organized social welfare programs. This Act of 1601 contained measures that addressed how assistance should be given to the poor. On this act, the poor was categorized into three classes. First are the able-bodied poor. They are those who would work but could not. Second are the impotent poor. They are those who were too old, ill, or young to work. Both of these poor categories are considered deserving poor. The third one is called the idle poor. They are those who could work but would not. They were to be whipped through the streets publicly until they learned the error of their ways. There were two types of relief available. First, the outdoor relief. Here, the poor would be left in their own homes and would be given either a dole of money on which to live or be given relief in kind, either in the form of clothes or food. Second is the indoor relief. Here, the poor would be taken into the almshouse. The ill would be admitted to the hospital. The orphans were taken into the orphanage. The idle poor would be taken into the poorhouse or workhouse where they would be set to work. The following are the amended pieces of legislation considered part of Act 1601. 1662, the Poor Relief Act, or the Act for the Better Relief of the Poor of this Kingdom. The Act is to establish the parish to which a person belonged, thus his or her place of settlement, to clarify which parish was responsible for him in case he would need poor relief. This is the first time when a document proving residence became statutory. The said document is called Settlement Certificate. This act gave the parishes the right to remove within 40 days of arrival any newcomer deemed likely to be chargeable, as well as any non-settled applicant for relief. 1723 Workhouse Test Act, also known as General Act or Notch Bulls Act. This is an act for amending the laws relating settlement, employment, and relief of the poor. It was named after its sponsor, Sir Edward Notch Bull. The workhouse test was that a person who wanted to receive poor relief had to enter a workhouse and undertake a set amount of work. The test was intended to prevent irresponsible claims on a parish's poor rate. 1782 Relief of the Poor Act, or also known as Gilbert's Act. This act was sponsored by Thomas Gilbert. This act expanded the units of poverty relief administration by setting up groups of parishes to form unions. Here, they could share the cost of poor relief through poor houses, which were established for looking after only the old, the sick, and the infirm. Able-bodied paupers explicitly were excluded from these poorhouses. Instead, either they were be provided with outdoor relief or employment near their own homes. Landowners, farmers, and other employers were to receive allowances from parish rates so they could bring wages up to subsistence levels. This act is considered a more humane method for the relief of poverty than the workhouse test. 1795 Speenham Land System. The Speenham Land System is a special program of outdoor relief by supplementation of wages through the so-called bread scale. It is an allowance scale whereby a laborer would have his income supplemented to subsistence level by the parish according to the price of bread and the number of his children in the family. 1795 Removal Act. This is an act of Parliament which modified the Settlement Act of 1662. According to this act, no non-settled person could be removed from a parish unless he or she applied for relief. The situations that warranted assistance to the poor in the 18th century are industrial revolution, urbanization, slums, and anonymity in living. Also in 18th century, there were attempts to help the poor in a dignified manner, and various programs, both public and private, came into existence. Here, we would see begging, almsgiving, charity, workhouses, orphanages, insane asylums, and jails. And in 1607, houses of correction were established in each county. These are places for punishment and reform of the poor convicted of petty offenses and even vagrancy. Bridewell Prison is the first house of correction. Another important event to take note of is the establishment of Bristol Corporation of the Poor. Bristol pioneered establishments of a central workhouse under the Old Poor Law. It established St. Peter's Hospital, which opened in 1698. Multipurpose welfare institution with clientele including lunatics and idiots for whom there was specific accommodations were established as well by the Bristol Corporation.
The 1834 Poor Law. In the Middle Ages, famines or the extreme scarcity of food, wars, crop failures, pestilence, or the spread of contagious and infectious diseases, and the breakdown in the feudal system all contributed to substantial increases in the number of people in need. Former approaches, primarily through the church and the family, were unsuccessful at meeting the needs of many who were unable to be self-sufficient. As a result, many of these individuals were forced to resort to begging. In the attempt to solve this social problem, England passed several poor laws, and one of them is the 1834 Poor Law. The new poor law meant to reduce the cost of looking after the poor and imposed a system which would be the same all over the country. It aims for the reduction of the authority of the local parishes. It provided for a centralized administration with a pattern of uniformity throughout the country. The new poor law ensured that the poor were housed in workhouses, clothed and fed, and the children who entered the workhouse would receive some schooling. In return for this care, all workhouse paupers or those recipient of care would have to work for several hours each day. The central authority, 3 poor law commissioners. A central authority was needed to ensure a uniform poor law regime for all parishes and to ensure that that regime deterred applications for relief. A central poor law commission was established based in London with 3 commissioners to oversee the national poor law and impose national uniformity. The country were divided into districts, poor law unions that replaced the parishes as units of administration. Each district had an elective board of guardians with salaried officers who were responsible for the administration of relief. Parishes were to combine in poor law unions with each parish, taking a share of resources to maintain workhouse facilities. Each poor law union was to be governed by an elected board of guardians accountable to the Poor Law Commission. Workhouse is where relief was administered. Relief to able-bodied persons outside the workhouse was abolished. This group was given low-grade employment and citizens were prohibited from offering them financial help. Anyone who refused to work was placed in stocks or employment in the workhouse or in jail. 1860s London Society for Organizing Charitable Relief and Repressing Mendicancy or the Prevention of the Practice of Begging, or the London Charity Organizations known as LCO. This has 5 goals. The first one is to see that all deserving cases of destitution or the extreme poverty are properly relieved. The second one is to prevent discriminate and duplicate giving. Third, to make employment the basis of relief. Number 4, to secure the community from imposture or the pretensions or deceiving others that they are in need. Number 5 is to reduce vagrancy or homelessness and pauperism or poverty. There was a considerable increase in the number of applicants for aid due to series of wars, social reform, innovations, and change from the typical approaches of providing aid and reliefs. Pioneers in social welfare, Octavia Hill and Edward Denison, their efforts paved the way to the organization of the LCO. They founded the Charity Organization Society or the COS to investigate the living conditions and the mode of life of the poor. Finally, to compare the 1834 Poor Law and 1860s approaches and its significant events related to the history of social work, it focused to solve the problem resulting from the increase in expenditures on public relief from the previous poor laws.
As the history of social welfare in the United States has unfolded, so has the history of the profession of social work. Social and environmental issues confronting various population groups in America, poverty, employment, discrimination, war, oppression, and the like, have helped shape human services and social programs as well as the nature of social work as a profession. At times, the United States has developed positive strategies to address specific social problems. Consequently, some groups within the population have made tenuous social and economic gains. However, lasting change for the larger society has been limited when measured against complex problem of human need and social justice. The history of social work and social welfare can be divided into series of policy era, designated by landmark policy decisions and initiatives, Considering history in this way integrates the development of social work with a series of political issues and environmental factors that have affected what the nation has been willing and able to do for its citizens' welfare. The advocacy of social workers has helped ensure a degree of social justice when the government has addressed social concerns. The roots of social welfare in America had their beginnings in Europe, particularly related to the Elizabethan poor law of England. Towns and local communities assumed responsibilities for aiding the unfortunate and disadvantaged. Social welfare history describes the changes in helping activities and services initiated in the United States to combat a variety of social ills of complex origins. While poverty and public assistance play large roles in this narrative, they are not the entire story. Social welfare history reflects the lives of people living, being educated, working and voting in the nation. The efforts of individuals, religious groups, non-profit organizations, and governments recounted in this history have strengthened the fabric of American society and improved the quality of life for many who live within our borders. The early settlers who came to the United States carried with them the traditions, customs, and values of their countries of origin. Because the majority of the colonists were from England, they conceptualized and sought to address social problems such as poverty as they would have in England. In colonial America, welfare assistance took the form of mutual aid. Colonists relied on one another in times of need. It was the community's responsibility to provide assistance when an individual experienced a hardship such as a disease or home fire. Relatives and neighbors responded with the necessary assistance until the crisis situation passed or was somehow resolved. As churches took root in the colonies, they, too, would offer assistance to needy people. Overall, the public toward the poor and the needy people was respectful and benevolent, particularly since the harsh living condition of the colonies placed all the colonists potentially in harm's way. During 1800s, organizations and associations were formed and the act of helping became more formalized, like seminaries, inns, churches, hospitals, prisons, schools. Also, the interaction with the needy, the ill, and other social problems, distribution of books, and sending of missionaries in certain places, like the Home for Little Wanderers. The Home for Little Wanderers is a private non-profit child and family service agency. It has been part of the Massachusetts landscape for more than 200 years, making it the oldest agency of its kind in the nation and one of the largest in New England. Founded as an orphanage in 1799, the home today plays a leadership role in delivering services to thousands of children and families each year through a system of residential, community-based and prevention programs, direct care services, and advocacy. The home services include early intervention and prevention, foster care and adoption, clinical services, residential care, special education, and home-based family support. The mission of the Home for the Little Wanderers is to ensure the healthy behavioral, emotional, social, and educational development and the physical well-being of children and families living in at-risk circumstances. The Penitent Female Refuge Society was incorporated in 1823 and has gone on from time with only a temporary suspension of its labors, endeavoring under many discouragements to perform its appropriate work and home for intemperate women, in which volunteer efforts were frequently marked by a condescending attitude toward the recipients of services. Some volunteer services, by which 25 members of a junior league spent half a day a week and assisting activities in the local comprehensive mental health center, and existence of the Medical Wives Auxiliary that performs a variety kind of tasks in local hospitals, and volunteers from churches and religious groups minister to the sick, the poor, the destitute, and unfortunate.
Developing out of volunteer came social work as an occupation, based on the need created by the upheaval of civil war in 1861. From 1865, minor social work initiatives emerged: the American Red Cross and the United States Sanitation Commission. The commission was a private relief agency created by the Federal Legislation on June 18, 1861 to support sick and wounded soldiers of U.S. Army. The beginning of the Sanitary Commission is rooted in the meeting at the New York Infirmary for Women. Many women volunteered for the work with the Sanitary Commission. Some provided direct services at the field hospitals and camps, organizing the medical services, acting as nurses, and performing other tasks such as raise money and manage the organization. After the Civil War, many women volunteers found jobs in the basis of their Sanitary Commission experience, while some who do not find better opportunities became the female activists for women's rights. Many returned to their families and to traditional female roles as wives and mothers. The Sanitary Commission was disbanded in May of 1866. The Board of State Charities and successors from 1863 onwards oversaw Massachusetts state immigration and pauper relief functions, as well as the state charitable correctional institutions. They required municipalities to provide care for those state paupers to seek to move to state almshouse. Massachusetts Infant Asylum, founded by Frank B. Sanborn, among others, was a private institution incorporated in 1867 to house abandoned infants. The MBC, or the Massachusetts Board of Charities, was later merged in the General Department of Health, Lunacy, and Charity in 1879, but changed again by the setting of health jurisdiction to a separate body in 1886 and continued as Board of Lunacy and Charity. Poverty and poor relief, especially in times of acute food shortages, were major challenges during American Civil War. According to MBC, the causes of poverty were moral perversity, mental incapacity, accidents and infirmities, unjust and unwise laws, and customs of the society. In early 1870s, the concept of state boards spread to other states and many achieved greater administrative responsibilities. The typical state board of the charity consisted of a number of citizens appointed by the governor and serving without salary. And in 1900s, the responsibility for the program management was achieved. In 1877, the genesis of the Charity Organization Society, or COS movement, had its roots in urbanization and loss of the community and mutual aid prevalent in rural areas of Western countries. By their very nature, urban areas fostered industrial accidents, diseases, unemployment, poverty, family breakdown, and other social and economic problems. When afflicted by unemployment, sickness, old age, or physical disability, individuals and families without relatives or financial resources had few options. One is to apply for public relief, appeal to private charities, or beg help from strangers. The COS movement was introduced in the United States by the two men from Buffalo, New York, who were deeply concerned about the expanding destitution caused by long depression of the 1870s. The Buffalo COS and others that followed in the United States, like the London model, was intended to coordinate the city's numerous charitable agencies, but it went an important step further. Rather than provide indiscriminate provision of alms, the society focused on more directed philanthropy or scientific approach for distributing assistance. The main function of the COS is finding means to help the poor in preventing the poor from taking advantage of the numerous uncoordinated social agencies that had developed in many communities. They were called friendly visitors. They were trained people to contact clients. They believed poverty could be eradicated through introduction of additional scientific techniques, which are plant intervention or treatment.
The settlement movement began officially in the United States in 1886 with the establishment of University Settlement, New York. Settlements derived their name from the fact that the resident workers settled in the poor neighborhoods they sought to serve, living there as friends and neighborhoods. In the United States, the focus was also on city slums and the amelioration of wretched living conditions. The idea of settling in to learn as well as to help was eagerly embraced by a variety of caring groups. The settlement program was geared to upward mobility and a commitment to help each struggling group to become part of the mainstream. The cultural complexities of these neighborhoods also required humility on the part of the settlers, who had to learn before they could give, and who thought in broad social terms of community of welfare rather than in moral terms of charity and uplift. The U.S. settlement movement was also characterized by the leadership of many women who found in this type of service a fitting use of their energy and skill, alienated themselves from a society which failed to appreciate or utilize their abilities. They found in settlement movement an acceptable and satisfying calling. Jane Addams, Lillian Wald, Mary Simkovich, and many others, along with notable residents like Florence Kelly and Francis Perkins, found settlement work their entry into significant national affairs. A few settlements saw their task as experimenting with new ways to structure city life. Stanton Coit, the founder of University Settlement, had a vision of neighborhood guilds made up of units of 100 families, which would be self-determining and self-supporting, and able to carry out whatever local reforms were needed. The earliest calls for the development of formal educational programs for people working in charity came in 1893 in papers by Nathaniel Rosenow and Anna Dawes. Neither Rosenow or Dawes were interested in training direct service workers, but rather concerned with the need for agency administrators to be trained experts. Rosenow questioned the criteria used to hire agency executives and criticized the tendency to select the superannuated clergyman, unsuccessful merchant, or political favorite to serve as manager of a charitable agency or institution. He argued that it was necessary that persons take charge of this work who are especially trained, who have calling for the work and who mean to devote themselves to it. The New York School of Applied Philanthropy, originally opened as a 6-week summer program in New York City in 1898, was the first higher education program to train people who wanted to work in the field of charity, including child development and youth work in the United States. The New York School of Philanthropy was formed under the guidance of Edward T. Devine, Secretary of the New York COS, or the Charity Organization Society. The school expanded from the summer to full-time curriculum, or from a 6-week summer session to 1 year then 2 years training for social workers. And the course developed into a 1-year training program within the New York School of Philanthropy, in which full programs dedicated social work education began to take shape. Among them, Columbia University partnered with the New York College of Science to develop and offer the first social work class. Despite increased training opportunities for social workers, there remain a lot of uncertainty about the future of the profession.
18th and 19th centuries. How did social work become visible during industrialization and greater mobility? The response of the first American charity organization society to the social consequences of industrialization is through scientific charity. This is a movement to lift the poor out of poverty with education and employment so that they could support themselves without government assistance. This charity did not receive state aid but depended on donations mainly from wealthy Americans during that period. Another response to some of the societal changes caused by industrial expansion is the settlement houses. Settlement houses are neighborhood-based organizations that provide services specific to the needs of their neighborhoods, much like a community center. This new type of social service agency focused on correcting the environmental causes of poverty. Their activities included conducting research, establishing a juvenile court system, creating widows' pension programs, promoting legislation, prohibiting child labor, and introducing public health reforms and the concept of social insurance. What was social work in 19th century? In this period, early social work education programs are born. Full programs dedicated social work education began to take shape. Columbia University partnered with the New York College of Science to develop and offer the first social work class. In 1904, Simmons College in Boston collaborated with Harvard University to establish the Boston School for Social Workers. Simmons was the first college to provide training for clinical social workers, and by 1908, a full curriculum social work program was offered through the Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy, which is now known as the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. In 1905, the first medical social work department was established by Ida Cannon at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Ida Cannon was an early social work leader who made a major contribution to the building of the profession. Trained as a nurse, she attended the Boston School of Social Work. She was convinced that medical practice could not be effective without examining the link between illness and the social conditions of the patient. She also believes that there should be within the hospital someone definitely assigned to represent the patient's point of view. Medical social workers became interested in professional education as a means of moving from the warm heart position into an understanding of the psychic or social conditions at the base of patient distress. In 1912, a 1-year course in medical social work was established in Boston School of Social Work. And during the meeting of the National Conference on Charities and Corrections in 1915, Abraham Flexner, an authority on graduate education, asked, "Is social work a profession?" Abraham Flexner has 6 criteria in considering something as a profession. And one of his criteria is that a profession must have definite and specific ends. For him, this is not true for a social work. Unlike other professions like medicine, law, architecture, engineering, those professions have a clear line about their respective fields. He said, and I quote, "We observed that professions need to be limited and definite in scope in order that practitioners may themselves act, but the high degree of specialized competency required for action and conditioned on limitation of area cannot possibly go with the width of scope characteristic of social work." End quote. These are the additional highlights during 19th century. This period marked the first time social workers were called upon to treat social issues that weren't limited to poverty. One example of this is when the Red Cross and the Army requested social workers to apply casework skills to treat soldiers for shell shock or those soldiers who underwent post-traumatic stress disorders during the war. Also in the early 19th century, social workers began to work in conjunction with psychiatrists and psychologists. These cooperative efforts helped to spark legitimization of the field, and by 1927, more than 100 child guidance clinics were opened to provide services primarily to middle-class clients. In addition to these clinics, the community chest movement began in 1913. In 1921, the American Association of Social Workers was created, the first major professional social work body. And in 1935, the Social Security Act revolutionized the social welfare scene. This act is signed into law by President Roosevelt in 1935, created Social Security, a federal safety net for elderly, unemployed, and disadvantaged Americans. The main stipulation of this original Social Security Act was to pay financial benefits to retirees over age 65 based on lifetime payroll tax contributions.
The National Association of Social Workers, or NASW, with more than 140,000 members as of 2013, is the largest membership organization of professional social workers in the world. Started in 1955, its goals are to build and develop the field of social work, to enhance professional growth and development of its members, to create and maintain professional standards, and to promote sound social work policies. The first formal step leading toward the establishment of NASW was taken in 1948 by key representatives of the following 7 organizations: American Association of Social Workers, American Association of Medical Social Workers, National Association of School Social Workers, American Association of Psychiatric Social Workers, American Association of Group Workers, Association for the Study of Community Organization, and Social Work Research Group. In the years that followed, careful study was given by the membership of all the associations to the principles on which the new organization was to be created. This study culminated in an overwhelming affirmative vote on the part of the members of all 7 organizations to establish the National Association of Social Workers in October of 1955. The attainment of this long-sought objective reflected the growing conviction on the part of social work practitioners that there was a need for greater unity within the social work profession and an organizational structure through which the resources of the profession could be utilized most effectively for the improvement and strengthening of social welfare programs. The Public Welfare Amendments of 1962, which became a law with President Kennedy's signature on July 25, 1962, represent the most important changes in the public welfare provisions of the Social Security Act. The changes emphasize rehabilitation services and the training of staff, liberalize payments, and provide states with significant new tools for making welfare programs more effective. The following are the major modifications and additional provision in the Act. Number 1. Additional federal participation through greater sharing in the cost of rehabilitative services to recipients, applicants, and possible applicants for social public assistance. Number 2. Liberalization of grants wherein the federal share in the cost of public assistance payments increased. 3. Safeguarding the rights of children and families through extending aid to children removed from an unsuitable home. And 4. Greater emphasis on rehabilitation and preventive social welfare. The most significant administrative change involved the signing of Social Security Amendment Act, also known as the Medicare Bill, on July 13, 1965. President Lyndon Johnson signed the bill in the presence of former President Harry Truman, who received the first Medicare card at the ceremony. Also present were Lady Bird Johnson, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and Mrs. Truman. With the signing of this bill, Social Security Act became responsible for administering a new social insurance program that extended health coverage to almost all Americans aged 65 or older. Nearly 20 million beneficiaries enrolled in Medicare in the first 3 years of the program. People 65 years and older had a chance to purchase supplemental medical insurance. Meanwhile, Medicaid provided medical care and health insurance program to low-income people. It was also in the 1960s when working as volunteer became a characteristic of the American way of life. The United States Department of Labor reported 22 million individuals who made contributions to some health, education, or welfare service on a voluntary basis. Most social reforms stagnated by the mid-1970s because of a belief that many of the social programs of the Great Society had created social unrest in America. Starting with the Nixon administration, the federal government pulled back on the social reform of the previous decades. Despite a growing conservative and anti-government attitude, there were significant changes in the social work profession. These changes included multicultural and gender awareness, which prompted new course content and minority recruitment, multidisciplinary joint degree programs with schools of urban planning, public health, public policy, education, and law. In 1973, Council on Social Work Education, or CSWE, issued accreditation standards covering content in the social work curriculum, staffing, and organization of social welfare programs at the undergraduate level, and in 1974, the National Commission on Accrediting formally authorized CSWE to accredit Bachelor of Social Work as an entry-level degree program and created joint degrees with other public policy sectors. The privatization of social work practices also grew, giving social workers greater autonomy and legitimacy.
Social workers are dedicated to enhancing human well-being and helping meet the basic needs of all people. We work to empower people who are vulnerable, oppressed, or living in poverty. Social work has been around for more than a century. Our profession has been instrumental in pushing for major social reforms, including Social Security, the minimum wage, and equal rights for minorities, women, and people who are LGBTQIA. We need social workers now more than ever. Today, social work professionals are tackling issues that include income equality, access to health care, and care for our aging population. Social work is one of the fastest growing professions in the country. There are more than 700,000 social workers in the United States, and that number is expected to rise to almost 800,000 by the year 2028. Social work is incredibly diverse. You'll find social workers in mental health, substance abuse treatment, healthcare, family and children's services, aging, in schools, and in local, state, and federal government.